Hi everybody, this is Esha from Leora.ai and you're listening to the Leora Workplace Wellbeing Podcast, the show that provides micro learnings for people that aspire for a great place to work. Today we're talking about how to have difficult conversations. This is with Arabella Macpherson, who is the founder and director of Resonate Communications. We're going to discuss everything there is to know about planning, positioning, and presenting your points when you're about to go into a hard conversation. Thanks for joining us, Arabella.
My pleasure, Esha. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. So where should we begin? Why is it so challenging, firstly, why do we find it so hard to have a hard conversation?
It's a good question. And I think it comes a lot to how you were brought up. We don't want to go into pop psychology here, but it does have a massive impact on how you have conversations as an adult. So you might have come from a household where it was very free and open and you were allowed to express your emotions and you knew you were safe to be angry or upset and you would be supported and loved regardless of how you behaved. Or you might have come from a household where emotions were repressed, they weren't spoken about. It was something you just dealt with behind closed doors. And so as an adult, we're constantly, especially when we're under pressure, being triggered by different things that may have nothing to do with what's actually going on, but more to do with your childhood.
Do you think there's value in an individual understanding their childhood, or do you believe that on the path of improving our ability to communicate effectively, we can bypass history?
I laugh because I recently had this conversation on the weekend and I was saying, do we really have to talk about our story? Like, do we really have to go into the past? Can't we just deal with who we are right now, which is a product of the past? But with this conversation with this person, we started to talk about things that have affected us, have impacted us. And I just got a whole new, deeper understanding of myself in this current situation, why I got there. I think what's important is not to cling on to the past as it's because of that or because of this, or and get into that feeling shame and blaming people or situations or experiences we've had in the past. But it can be helpful to go, okay, that makes sense, because our number one goal is to have self-compassion. And if it helps us understand ourselves and go, well, you know what, that makes sense that I would react like that because of this situation or that situation, then I think that's helpful. So whenever I'm doing coaching or interacting with people, I constantly ask, is this helpful? And it's helpful if you can acknowledge it and go, okay, that's probably why I'm responding in this way, but now I can let that go. That is helpful. If you go, the world's against me, everyone has to treat me a certain way, you have to speak to me like this in order for me to be okay, then that is definitely not helpful. Does that make sense?
It brings up a lot of things for me because obviously we got to know each other because I reached out. I constantly was self-sabotaging myself in presentations and when I had to deliver key messages. In fact, I'm kind of nervous because I'm speaking to a communications coach and now, no, I'm not. So I know we started on that journey and I remember that it was really useful for me to understand why I would go into these cycles of confusion or triggers, whether it's presenting to a large group or having a challenging conversation one-on-one settings, it tends to bring up certain emotions. So yeah, I do agree. And then it's that ability to let it go, right? Shine some light on it, understand it, become aware of it, but also then have that ability to let it go. That's, I think, the key part of it.
Yeah, and the reason I was jumping in is sometimes we want to jump to the letting go without processing that emotion first, and I think that's very dangerous. Is to go, oh, that's the past, I should be over that. You know, now I understand it, I'm going to let that go. Is to go, okay, let's just acknowledge and honor the feelings that I felt back then, which was angry or hurt or not heard or not supported. And really process those emotions. And by process, I mean by sitting with them and breathing into them and knowing that you're not going to die. I remember seeing a therapist years ago. And I mean, apart from being a communications coach for 16 years, I have had therapy for about 20 years, just because I was an actress and opera singer, and we all had our therapists. But on top of that, with clients, I always had client supervision, make sure that I was in the healthiest place, and all my stuff would come up in sessions as well. But I remember being with this therapist, and it was years ago, and we had to sit and process these negative emotions. And I just did not want to go there. I wanted to distract him. I was being charming. I was, talking about his life. I was doing everything I could to not process my emotions. And finally, he got me to a place where I was able to sit with grief or sadness or whatever I was feeling. And at the end of it, he said, see, it wasn't too hard. You didn't have to call the wambulance. And I was like, wow. I've never forgotten that. I was like, the wambulance, really? That was, but it's true. Like the emotions aren't going to kill you. They're not going to hurt you. And yet we will do everything not to feel them. I remember when my dad died, oh my God, I did everything. I tried to get a puppy. I looked at buying an apartment for 3 months. Every weekend I was researching apartments. I mean, all of these things aren't bad things, but I remember eating a whole plate of profiteroles. I love profiteroles. I was just like, and then I just went, Bella, stop. What's going on for you? And then just breathing into that grief and that sadness and that despair and that anger and frustration. And then I was okay. I was like, wow, because under all of those emotions is peace.
It's so interesting. I'm getting goosebumps as you're talking, because the intent for us to bring these insights into corporate is to tackle communication challenges. But what I find with every guest speaker now, that seems to be a trend, is we end up talking about emotions and feelings and processing of our own negative, or I don't like to call them negative or positive, but just the whole spectrum of feelings and emotions tends to be the ones that we label as negative, that we suppress.
Yeah.
And then, we overshadow them with all these bad habits. But okay, let's go to your point about when we have an opportunity to address something. There might be a miscommunication or a reoccurring misunderstanding between a coworker, or peers, our managers in the workplace. We tend to avoid the conversation. Can you talk us through what's your best insight or advice on the steps that we need to take so we feel comfortable to lean in and open up? Let's open up the discussion.
And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that it is really scary. It's super scary having those conversations. And I remember when I first had the courage to speak up, and I blurted it out, and it sounded angry, and that other person was shocked, and I was shocked. And it was a really frightening experience, because we're tribal, right? And we come from tribes, which means that we want to be loved and accepted. And our biggest fear is not being good enough and being rejected. And we're putting ourselves potentially in a position where that person might reject us because we're speaking our truth. And that's the interesting thing, is usually when you feel triggered, it's because your boundaries are being crossed. So maybe you don't feel heard, or maybe someone you feel disrespected, or maybe it's triggering of something in the past. Whatever it is, we don't feel heard or valued. And that will bring up intense feelings of anger, which is usually hiding shame or fear. And so the first step is being able to acknowledge what you're feeling and going, oh, wow, I'm having an intense reaction here. And I'll talk about what to do when you're in that situation. But in an ideal world, you're able to sit and breathe through those emotions and ask, first of all, what's coming up for me? Like, what's really going on here? Because it's not about that person. It's not about the situation. And often what I find is, for example, I had a client who had just been fired from a role. And I said, where else have you been fired? And they've been fired from 3 other roles. So it was a pattern. Like we're a constant set of patterns. We keep recreating the same scenarios over and over again. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So the first job is to look at yourself and say, okay, what's coming up for me? What situation am I in, and how am I feeling right now? And then we start to have a look at, okay, what's happened? What's the situation that's occurred? And why is this triggering me right now? So having that understanding just means that you can then prepare to have a conversation with that other person. So that's the first step. Now, if you're in the situation and you start feeling intense emotions, then you have to give yourself ways to exit that conversation. And there are ways of doing it. When you get to a very, very advanced level, then you can do it in the moment. You can start to breathe through your emotions and speak up. And I have only, just in the last few years been able to do that, feel strong emotions and say, I'm feeling really scared right now, or I feel really frustrated, or I'm feeling angry, without shame, blame, or attack, but just acknowledging what I'm feeling, and not saying whether I'm right or wrong, or the other person's right or wrong, just going, whoa, I'm just having an emotional reaction here. I need some time out, or can we have a postpone this conversation? Whatever that is. But having that ability that as soon as you don't feel good, how am I going to get myself out of this situation so I can have some time to work out what's going on for me? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I can see how we can frame it for a more corporate setting where sometimes feelings are not so well received because we're still learning how to verbalize our emotions and feelings in a corporate environment. So yeah, something as simple as I'm feeling a level of discomfort right now. Can we reschedule this for another time?
Yeah. And you can
well
even if you feel uncomfortable saying what you feel at all, or what discomfort's a great word. I really love that you use that, because it's a state and people feel more comfortable with state. Like I'm feeling agitated, or I feel something that's a physical state is much more palatable for people in a social arena to take. So I'm feeling a level of discomfort is great. But you might even just say, hey, can we take some time out? Can we just stop here and reconvene this afternoon or tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely. I need to recollect my thoughts. I need
Yes.
to recalibrate on my thinking around this. Let's
Yes.
reconnect. So there's lots of ways that we can actually communicate this in a way that is not sort of intrusive for another person, because obviously we're all on different journeys when it comes to our emotional understanding.
At the same time, if you are in a situation, and I do have clients that, for example, one client was telling me that this person was in several meetings where people were shouting at this person, and that's not okay. So being able to say, this communication is not okay. We need to stop it and reconvene at a different time. That's also good. But your ability to do that in the moment is very, very limited, because two people can only communicate if they're both in okay space. And as soon as one person goes into distress, they attack, they blame, or they shut down, and that other person will quickly follow. So your goal is, when that person is shouting at you, how do you prevent yourself going into distress? And it's almost impossible. So you want to come up with these phrases before you go into any meeting or situation that might be problematic. And maybe I can give you a list to put with this podcast, just so that people have a list that they can bring out at any time in case they're feeling uncomfortable. If they're going into a meeting that they know is with someone who often triggers them, or often will bring out a difficult conversation or be challenging, then even more so, you want to go in with phrases and even pre-frame the conversation and say, look, we're here to have a conversation about this. If at any point either of us feels uncomfortable, then we need to find an exit and come back. Is that okay? So you can pre-frame potentially difficult conversations.
Sounds great. And then if you
it sounds great in an ideal world. Wouldn't that be great?
I just
that we
wish
had
it was
that.
so comfortable when you're in it. Isn't it?
Yeah. So easy. It's just the easiest thing.
So if you have time and you've actually prepared, you know that you're going to go into this meeting and you've actually prepared, what's the structure that should be followed ideally?
Great. And there's a couple of different structures. There's one that it's really interesting because there's a book called Thanks for the Feedback, and I've read lots around having difficult conversations. But I think before we go look at structure, it's important to understand why people are often getting angry or frustrated or having a difficult conversation in the first place. Is that helpful?
Absolutely. Yeah,
So,
let's go to that.
well, I think I might have told you, but I have a prison guard who lives across the road, and she's worked in the two major prisons in Sydney for 25 years, and she's great. I really enjoy our interactions, and I remember saying to her, "Oh, you're going away for the weekend?" She's like, "Why? You want to rob me?" And I was like, "Oh, no." I said, "Is anything worth robbing?" And no. But she's really great person. And so when I was running a workshop on difficult conversations in an industry where people actually lose it a lot, I won't say which industry, but one where they already have explosive conversations. So I thought I'd talk to her. I was ringing around and speaking to psychiatrists and clinical psychologists and other people, psychotherapists, but I wanted to have a chat with her. And so I went across the road, and she said, "Come back at 3:00. So I came back at 3 with a plate of freshly baked scones and jam and cream. And she said, no, I don't eat any of that. I said, "No worries, put that aside." And I said to her, "So what do you do when someone's losing it? You know, you've worked in prisons for 25 years. And she goes, "Oh, I don't know." And I said, "Well, you must know. I mean, you've had such a long career." And she goes, "Well, I don't know. Should we role play it?" And I was like, "Oh, what? You want me to be the prisoner?" She said, "Yeah, you be the prisoner and I'll be the prison guard." And I was like, "Okay." So there I was in her driveway shouting and hitting the fence and going, "I want my drugs. No one's listening to me," like shouting and hitting the fence. And she bent her knees and looked up at me, got eye contact. She's like, hey, what do you need? You can tell me. What do you need? And I just stopped and I went, "That's a really good question." And she goes, "No, they're way worse than that." But the point being is that people often lose it when their needs are not being met. The problem is that most people don't know how to articulate what they need. And if we look at bodies of work such as nonviolent communication, brilliant body of work, which has now been renamed to compassionate communication, but I prefer nonviolent. Anyway, it talks about meeting people's needs. Like, how do you feel? What do you need? What's your request? It's very, very simple. So I'm feeling this. This is the need I have that's not being met. This is my very specific request. And that person can either go, "Okay," and meet that request, or they say, "I can't meet that request." And then you go into negotiation. But once you're able to articulate what you need, then they've used this technique to nullify wars and huge international feuds. So it's really about finding out what each person needs.
You've distilled it down to literally 3 points. And can you repeat that again? I think it's really useful. Anything, even when you're requesting something from a manager, it would be the same as the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first of all, acknowledging what you're feeling. So if you're making a request, you might say, I'm not feeling heard, or I'm feeling disrespected, or I'm feeling frustrated that I'm not getting opportunities, or whatever you're feeling is your feelings. And that's and they say this in therapy, but it's a non-threatening way to speak to someone, because they can't argue with what you feel. And you're not accusing them. You're not saying you're manipulative, or you're ignoring me, or you're narcissistic. You're not labeling the other person. You're simply expressing how you're feeling. And then saying, this need of mine is not being met. And when we look at needs, we can look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs of food, shelter, water. Once those are satisfied, people have a need for belonging, for connection, for respect, for freedom and autonomy. If they're being micromanaged, they might say, I'm feeling really frightened, or I'm feeling frustrated, or I'm feeling stifled at work. My need for autonomy is not being met. And that's, can I make a specific request? Can I ask that we check in at the beginning of the project and then 2 weeks later so that I can show you what I've done. And that gives me the freedom, and you explain why. As you do to children, you explain why they have to do certain things. And that takes the heat out of it, takes responsibility for you meeting your own needs, because no one can meet your needs but you. And it makes it very clear to the other person what it is that they need. The problem is that person might not be capable of helping you meet that need.
Yeah. And what makes sense about this structure as well, and we follow this process, and I'm sure there's multiple ways to do this, and there's probably other options as well. But when we follow this particular process, I can see it where it might even clarify whether, if that person can't meet the particular need, it could be something that's actually very much your own circumstances. And there's an opportunity then to own it as well. So it clarifies it. I think it gives a level of clarity.
Do you know what? The biggest thing for people is feeling heard. So often, even if that person can't help you meet that need or isn't able to, simply validating, I hear you and I can see how important that is to you. Right now, that's not really possible. What we can do, and you can negotiate with them, but just feeling heard, that's 99.9% of people's issue. Even in couples and relationships, simply feeling heard and validated that is your experience is so big. So that's just one side. That's if you need to have a conversation because your needs are not being met. Maybe your boundaries are being crossed or something's going on. But if you're a manager and you need to talk to someone, then it's a different structure. And I think the most important thing when you're talking to someone in your team or someone that you're having challenges with is to make sure that you go to the data of what actions and behaviors that you've seen. So often I used to use this structure where, first of all, you meet the psychological needs of that person. And I'm not so sure, there's a couple of theories of thought around that. For example, you could say, Esha, I'm really impressed with what you're doing with this project at the moment. You're meeting all the deadlines and you're coming in below budget. It's excellent. I've noticed, and then you go to I've noticed that sometimes in meetings, you'll speak over your teammates. And then we go into when, what, how. When you do that, they don't speak up and they don't share, and they possibly don't get an opportunity to add to the project, which might make it even better and take the pressure off you. What are your thoughts? And that allows the other person to speak up. And then how should we go forward? So it's the when, what, how. But first of all, meeting the psychological needs by praising you for what is important to you. And then I've noticed is a very neutral way of bringing something up. Now, in some cases, it might be better just to say, can we have can I have a conversation with how we're working together? Or can I have a conversation of how you're leading your team? And getting that permission first. And then I look at DISC. This is the data. This is what I've noticed. This is the impact it's having. These are some suggestions as to how we could go forward. What are your thoughts? And then getting consensus as to what needs to happen. So there are many different structures, but the biggest thing is never, ever label the other person. Like, you're lazy, you're belligerent.
People still do that.
Well, yes.
Yeah. No, I think what's incredible is these structures actually give a lot of control over the conversation, because the thing around hard discussions and difficult conversations is the fact that it brings up a lot of emotions. So straight away, when you embed some of these structures, whether it's the DISC or it's the what, how, etc., why, it frames it and controls it. So you're speaking within a framework, and then it leaves that little room for explosive feelings.
Yeah, and the thing is that once you have a structure, it gives you a way to begin the conversation, and it gives you, as you said, parameters, so you can feel safe that It's giving you a structure that you can follow. Now, for the most part, however, when you have a difficult conversation and someone's not prepared for it, they usually will get defensive. I remember a very close friend of mine, I brought it up that I felt like she was changing when we were meeting all the time. And that person became defensive and then later came back, a month or two later and apologized. So I think, and I've done it too, I've got defensive in the moment because I'm scared. You're scared of not being good enough or being a bad person or being rejected. And it's a natural instinct to want to defend yourself. I'm getting better at it, and it depends on the day and how you're feeling, what's going on in your life. And that's why we meditate, to make sure that on a daily basis, we're coming back to that center and learning how to breathe through emotions. But the thing is that you have to expect or be aware that that other person might react badly. And again, have exit strategies in which you say, okay, look, I know there's a lot of information right now. Can we reconvene next week?
And Bella, you brought up meditation.
Yeah.
So in the past, what's been helpful for me is to visualize the conversation in a meditation. Are there other things that you could potentially do? Like, is it a good idea to maybe even role play? Like, what are some things that can help you prepare more?
That's great that you visualize it, because you can do a lot with the unconscious mind before you go into a conversation. And usually our unconscious mind reacts when we haven't done something before. We get scared but if you visualize having that conversation and it going well, or even meditate on the other person's position. Why would a rational thinking, feeling person behave in this way? Like, what am I missing? Agile ways of working is such a great body of work that starts with the premise of I am wrong. How can I be less wrong? How can I be less wrong? And if you go into conversations going, you know what, I'm wrong. And how can I be less wrong? How can I understand this person's position better? And that puts you in a much more humble position, as opposed to I'm the saint, they're the villain, which isn't necessarily helpful. But what you can do in the actual conversation, there's many ways, but there are three main ways that you can diffuse strong emotions. And the first one is slightly controversial, which is apologizing, because I know there's a lot of work around women apologizing all the time. And I've noticed myself, I've gone back to apologizing when I bump into someone, and not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but when they bump into me. But it's called a no-net move to apologize, because it doesn't seemingly give you power. However, it can diffuse a lot of anger and frustration and fear very quickly. For example, I'm really sorry that we find ourselves in this situation. I'm really sorry that we're having this conversation.
It's got to come from a good place.
Absolutely.
I can see an apology could come across almost sarcastic, depending on the content of the discussion.
Esha, you've brought up a really important thing, which is with any of these conversations, you want to be authentic. And you want to know that no one behaves badly because they want to. Usually it's because they don't know how to meet their needs positively, so they meet them negatively. For example, with people who micromanage, they're desperate to be recognized for the quality of the work and their time structure. And so their biggest question is, am I competent? And if they have a team and that team isn't performing to that incredible level of excellence that they believe will get their needs met, then they start attacking the team. So it's because they want to be acknowledged and have their needs met that they'll behave negatively. So no one behaves badly because they want to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we go into those conversations knowing that this person's behaving, in inverted commas, badly because of reasons that are outside of our knowledge or understanding or awareness, or because of other factors or things that are going on that we don't know, then we go in from a much more considered place. And also acknowledging that we're constantly making mistakes. Oh my God. I remember early 20s, I was so self-righteous. I was like, you're right, you're wrong. And then I made mistakes and more mistakes and more mistakes. And I went, oh my God. I actually worked with a life coach a few years ago, and he said to me, can you say to me, I am wrong and that's okay? I said, sure. I went, and I couldn't say it. And I started sweating. I was like taking shallow breaths, and I was feeling really, all these emotions came up. And it was because like I loved my father, but he was very critical and wanted me to be the best at what I did because his parents were critical of him and so on. But to be wrong was so scary because I might not get love. So I pushed myself to be the best coach I could be, learn everything about behavior, did everything to not be wrong. And I didn't even realize that that was an issue. So it took me, oh God, it took me about 8 months to be able to say I'm wrong and that's okay. Maybe even a year, embarrassingly. And then my life coach said, good work. Now we're going to take it a step further. I said, sure. He said, I will always be wrong and that's okay. And I went, mother. And so, but then it took me another 6 months. I will always be wrong and that's okay. And what you realize is there is no right or wrong. There is no right or wrong. There's just different perspectives. There's different intentions. There's different drives. There's different contexts. And so what you're really trying to do is understand what is going on here. And I've got scared and I'm angry or I'm frustrated or this is not happening for me, but what's happening for that other person? So the first thing is apologize. The second thing is it's called contrasting, where you say, I don't want to blame you. I do think this is both of our responsibility. I don't want to make this a bigger issue than it is. I do just want to find a solution. So you contrast what might be starting to happen in the conversation with where you actually want it to go. Does that make sense?
Yes, sounds so good. And I mean, as you're saying that, I can see how it would immediately diffuse anything negative that could come out of that, because it's positioning as well, right?
Positioning.
And it's almost like it's psychologically positioning the other person to say,
yeah,
I'm seeking solutions.
but also calling out what might be happening. I don't want to anger you. I do want us to find a supportive way for both of us to move forward. And then the third thing that you can do is create a mutual purpose, which means our overall goal here is to have a wonderful working relationship. Like, let's just remind ourselves, and it's called chunking up. They introduced chunking, and this is, I haven't had this validated, but apparently they brought it into the Australian Defence Force. And so at the beginning of conversations, chunking up, what is our overall goal here? And what they've found is that if you start with agreement as to what your overall goal is, then you're more likely to end with agreement, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That sounds good. So just to recap, those 3 things were?
So the first one is apologizing. So saying, I'm really sorry we're in this situation. I'm really sorry we're having this conversation. Or I'm sorry that this has come up and that we're in this position right now. The second one is contrasting, is where you say what you don't want to happen and what you do want to happen. So you're turning the conversation from where it is going towards a better direction. So I don't want you to take the brunt of this blame. I do believe it's both of us that are a part of here. I don't want us to create an even bigger situation than what it is. I do want us to work well together. So it's calling out what's happening in the conversation and redirecting it in a more helpful way, and then creating a mutual purpose, which is chunking up. What is our overall goal? What do we actually want to achieve here? What's the overall purpose for us having this conversation in the first place?
This is meant to be bite-sized insights, and I knew that this was going to be longer than expected, just because you're full of so much wonderful experience and strategies. I think there's a lot that can be taken out of this in terms of just preparing well. I love the fact that you said that sometimes our subconscious mind has fear of the unknown. So even playing that, preparing well, having a framework, and then softening the communication using some of those strategies around contrast and offering an apology, of course, if it's authentic. And so, and of course the chunking of the content. Thanks, Bella. Thank you for your time today. I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. And I hope that our listeners got a lot out of it.
Thanks, Esha.